All right, should we get started? Righteous. Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a todos y todas. Y muchas gracias por atender este evento importante. Hablan español ustedes, ¿no? One person. Not in Spanish. I was hoping I'd get a bigger laugh with that one. It is, however, my sincere honor and privilege to introduce Professor Ernesto López Morales of the prestigious Universidad San Sebastián in Chile. Ernesto is a world-renowned urban planner and interdisciplinary urbanist who earned his doctorate in urban planning from University College London, as well as a bachelor's degree in architecture and a master's in urbanism, both from the Universidad de Chile in Santiago de Chile. He is the author, along with co-authors Hyun Bang Shin and Loretta Leese, of two major books on gentrification in global perspective. The first of these, Global Gentrification's Uneven Development and Displacement in 2015, and the second, Planetary Gentrification, the following year in 2016. Ernesto's work on housing, segregation, gentrification, and many other issues has been published in too many important academic journals to list, and we are extremely lucky that he has agreed to join us here at HKU for the next couple of weeks. He will also be giving seminars on other topics in the Department of Geography as well as the Department of Urban Planning and Design, so do look out for the announcements for these events as well. This afternoon, Ernesto will be sharing his methodological expertise on the topic of, as you can see, rent gap analysis in density areas in Chile, which should be interesting and beneficial to many of us here today. There'll be some time for Q&A at the end, so please do pay careful attention and take advantage of this opportunity to learn from the expertise of Ernesto. So without further ado, please do put your hands together and join me in welcoming Professor Ernesto López Morales.
Well, thank you very much, Ben Tarani, for inviting me to give this presentation here in front of you. Thank you very much for attending it. I will present about the case of Santiago, Chile, in Latin America. I don't know if you know where Chile is in South America. It's a very long and narrow strip of land next to Argentina in the south of South American continent. And the Santiago city, which I will use as a case, is the capital of Chile, currently around 7 million people as population. So I will speak about rent gap in density areas in Santiago, Chile, because this city is rapidly verticalizing and high-rise buildings, residential high-rise buildings are sprouting everywhere and creating sort of different inequalities, which I try to address in this presentation, not particularly gentrification, although we do not disregard some cases of gentrification, but there are other forms of inequality related to this type of development in this city, which is more or less representative of Latin American cities that it is good to analyze. So my outline for today, very simple. First, the context of Latin American urban development, basically the city of Santiago as an example. Secondly, I will discuss issues of the rent gap. I don't know how acquainted are you to the concept of the rent gap. It has been traditionally related to gentrification. We address in this research that the concept should not be, I mean, it is important to use it to analyze different things beyond gentrification. It is useful, and it's very clear the information that it gives if we apply it to different scenarios. Thirdly, how we build variables in this rent gap analysis in Santiago. Fourthly, an econometric estimation of rent gap, given the data we could gather. And finally, conclusions of this research. So since this is a methods hub, I try to be the more methodological I could be. So results here will be important, but I would like to go in depth and try to explain what we did in this analysis. So as a context, this is the city of Santiago, more or less in the center of the country. 7 million people, as I said. It is like most Latin American cities, highly segregated. If we see the green area here, this green area is the upper income area. All the rest is middle income and low income areas. If we take the city 100 years ago, basically it was the same structure with fewer people, around 1 million people. And the thing is that the city has expanded, has grown, but without losing this structure. Some scholars call it large-scale segregation model of Latin American cities. So you have broad areas where people live segregated. If they're affluent, they live here from the center to the east. And if they are middle class, they gather around these other areas. And in the peripheries, usually Latin American cities concentrate state-funded social housing, most of it not really good quality. And if this was a Brazilian city, for instance, say Rio de Janeiro, we would have favelas all around this central area, but this is not the case. Brazilian cities are very exceptional in that way, where you can find poverty niches very near the center. That's because the particular geography of Brazilian cities in the coast, all these hillsides and all this geomorphology, but that's not the case in the rest of Latin American cities. So Buenos Aires, Santiago, Mexico City respond more to this large, broad-scale segregation pattern. So we call this the uptown or upper income area in the city. Now, what is this metro lines, this metro infrastructure doing in these cities? Completely transforming this pattern. Now, this is another way to see how poverty and rich and wealthy areas segregate. So the darker the area, the higher the number of families in need of housing. So Latin American cities also are cities which are characterized by high levels of homeless households living with relatives or living in the streets or living in shanty towns. In fact, Santiago it used to be an exception for Latin American cities because it didn't have shanty towns or so many shanty towns, but for the last 10 years, that situation no longer exists. And the number of shanty towns or favelas, particularly in the periphery of the city, has been growing. Anyway, this map shows also how the distribution of income and wealth happens in the city, because in this central eastern part, you scarcely find areas where people are in need of housing. But the metro structure investment by the state in metro infrastructure is very decisive in this city in particular. I would say more than Buenos Aires or Mexico City, probably. This is the network, metro network in Latin America that has most rapidly grown in the last 20 years. A lot of investment here, a lot of new lines. 2 other new lines are being built here that connect west and east again, and also in the southern part, a new line is being built. And all these are new lines. The yellow one is new. When I say new, it's no more than 15 years. This extension here is 15 years old. Extensions to the west, extensions to the north. So if we see this other map here, this is the concentration of units built and purchased from 2009 onwards. And the concentration goes around, very close to the metro network lines. And we calculated it's around 70% of the new units of apartments built within this time frame locate inside a radius of 1 kilometer from any station of this metro network. So why do I say that this network is transforming the traditional segregation pattern in Santiago? Because it's bringing middle classes all around these networks. Lower middle classes, upper middle classes. Some places are being gentrified, some others don't. But the thing is that there are other areas which are left unattended, no interest by the private market. By the way, this is just private market, privately led urban renewal, high-rise renewal. We call it verticalization. It's a very good way to call it, because high-rise buildings, say from 20 to 30, sometimes 40-story buildings being built. Nothing really spectacular compared to Hong Kong density, but for a Latin American city, which is characterized by 1 or 2-story buildings, this is really, really radical change. So for the last 15 years, say since the last financial crisis in 2008, which the Chilean economy felt decisively. From that time, housing prices have been rising in Chile and in Santiago in particular. So many people find that housing becomes an impossible dream. They say this is unaffordable for us. Middle classes no longer can purchase a dwelling, an apartment, and now they go to renting. So wealthy, affluent investors, companies, and individuals are gathering, accumulating housing. This is something that the literature on financialization, housing financialization, explains very well. But something that surprises me is that these developers, high-rise developers, say the explanation for this housing price increases is the land. Land is becoming more expensive for us, increasingly. So this is one of the first motivations to do this analysis. And I went to use the rent gap to try to see if this claim is real or not. And I will bring my conclusion forward now, and it is not. I mean, land costs are not explaining housing price increases. So this is a typical image of Santiago's verticalization. This is line 2 of the metro line that runs underground. So 20 years ago, this image would have been 1 or 2-story houses, very flat, like the rest of Santiago's inner area used to be. And now all these new buildings have been built, increasing density and also providing housing for many people. This is something we need to acknowledge. But the thing is that this housing is becoming more unaffordable every day, and we need to assess whether land is the reason for that unaffordability for the price of the housing. So this is another image, old areas, old neighborhoods. You see all these cables, typical of low-income areas in Latin American cities. And these brand new buildings, 20, 30-story buildings being built all around this area. This is another view. So we have these large empty land sites being renovated everywhere. And we can see the viaduct of line 5 there, Metro line 5 there, going in the background. So I want to discuss a little bit the concept of the rent gap. I've been studying this for a while, since my initial interest was gentrification, and rent gap and gentrification has been commonly associated. I think we should not take the rent gap so much associated to gentrification any longer. I think we need to discuss a little bit more what is rent gap and why rent gap, or what rent gap can help us to analyze. And not just to explain where rent gaps increase, gentrification will occur, because many scholars do that, and they associate large rent gaps with the appearance of gentrification almost automatically. And I think we need to give a more careful look at rent gap conceptually and empirically too. So what is rent gap exactly? It refers to the unequal distribution of land rent during redevelopment, leading to income disparities among parties involved. Particularly, which parties are interesting to see here: landholders, landowners, who happen to be mostly middle class, even lower middle class, owner residents in these inner areas under renovation. And the other parties are high-rise builders, who happen to be very powerful companies, because it's not easy or simple to have the financial, technical, and political will and force to build at such high rise. And something I want to stress is that the rent gap is about land rent. And there is a discussion between one of the initial researchers and the one who named the concept as rent gap, Neil Smith, a very famous scholar, gentrification scholar. He was debating with Steve Burras, a neoclassical economist in the 90s. And the point by Smith was precisely the rent gap is about the ground rent, it's about land rent. And why it is important to stress this? Because land rent is the value of land, which comes from external factors to the land site. It's nothing that the owner can do. The land rent is something created by external factors, say transport facilities, say amenities, say transformations at the metropolitan scale. Everything that affects land sites and increases the value that can be extracted from that land is named land rent. I mean, this is something Marx, Milton Friedman, Henry George, all agree about that. It's unearned value. So since land rent is unearned value, it is highly politically contestable if we see high levels of accumulation of land rent. To my views, that's the main point of the rent gap. Not whether rent gap leads to gentrification. Of course, that's important, but in places where gentrification is not the main problem, like in Santiago, we need to see this other inequality. The rent gap, that rent created by external factors, in this case, the metro network lines, which is state investments being accumulated or being captured by private agents. So the other point, which is interesting to see here, is that density rents. We are not talking about the same cases as Neil Smith saw in the 1970s and 80s. We're talking about high-rise renovation, new buildings. So these density rents have been explained by Xi et al., Chen in China, in Taiwan. Scholars have been working in this concept of density rent. And it depends on the size of the building, and the number of apartments, and the number of square meters built for a parcel of land, and the price of those units. So high price, high density, more density rent that can be extracted from a land site. That's the main point I want to make. Basically, in this study, we focus on verticalizing Santiago to estimate the land rent captured by the landholder. This is variable number 1, and the developer, variable number 4, as motivated by metro infrastructure. There is a vast literature field which confirms that metro transport networks impact in land and apartment prices. So I will do a very brief literature review now in the next slide. So this literature often call it premiums, land premiums, price premiums. We call it land rent. We say it's the same. If it's not created by the owner, that's valorization, that's land rent. And finally, the issue with gentrification. So whether there is displacement by low-income people in large rent gap areas, the rent gap and gentrification will be associated. But that's not the case always. I will show this in my next presentation, the 1st of March, in the planning department. Shen He invited me to give that because I don't have enough time here to do it. But we found that the largest rent gaps do not correlate with the higher displacement rates. And that's because the density rent, of course, obviously. Wherever more density is, even though apartments are not so pricey, but very high density areas will not create much displacement in Chilean cities. I don't know other parts, but in the Chilean cities, that will be the case. Now, I wrote this slide. This is extracted from a very famous paper by Vashmans and Weisler in New York, analyzing rent gap in Airbnb markets. And their point is that the rent gap increases due to short-term rentals, Airbnb. People extract higher rents because they send their premises to Airbnb rather than long-term rentals. So that's a very good point they make. My problem with this paper is that they don't call ground rent to these two values. They call it income. And the reason why they don't say ground rent, it's because they are not seeing basically ground rent. They are not seeing those effects coming from external factors, especially external factors like amenities, infrastructures. They are just seeing increases because there is a huge scarcity of housing in New York, and Airbnb is creating more scarcity. So that's a different type of rent. We need to go more deeply into the land rent theory and the rent theory. So there is a famous paper by Brett Christophers, the British geographer, in 2019, where he defines what rent are we talking about when we see this Airbnb. He says that's monopoly rent. It's a different type of rent. This increase is not basically ground rent, land rent. It's housing rent. It's monopoly rent due to Airbnb creation of scarcity of housing because people don't find housing to live permanently in New York now. So that is pushing prices up. But this is nothing to do with this rent gap that Neil Smith was seeing in 1979 and the rent that we want to see here in Santiago. Anyway, I brought this slide to show you the difference between capitalized ground rent, potential ground rent. Let's suppose that Bashmus and Weisler did refer to land rent. They would have called capitalized ground rent, potential ground rent to these two values. So basically, how does the rent gap work? It's a differential between a current value and a potential value in the future. Redevelopment brings that potential value to reality. That's the thing. So how do we call this area? The rent gap. So every developer knows this, this simple model. Every developer uses and applies it. So my point is that the metro line is bringing this potential ground rent up due to density construction, also upzoning. Of course, the state is highly involved by upzoning several areas near these metro stations. I wrote this other example. It's a very recent paper by Ziegler et al. From Australia. They analyzed Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast to see also short-term rentals. The green dots are short-term rentals compared to the orange dots, which are long-term rentals. And they sort of try to analyze this vis-a-vis William Alonso's type of curves, where we have a center here, periphery here, you see the distance here. So somehow, if we see, especially in the Sunshine Coast, if we see the higher values of short-term rentals near the beach, not the center, because the center is irrelevant in the Sunshine Coast, but the coast, the beach is the most relevant amenity. We see this sort of creation of land rent being expressed in this figure, if you see. The problem is that they don't disaggregate. You don't know how much of this box belongs to location and the rest belongs to the value of the premise, the value of the house. So that's a typical problem that rent gap analyzers find always. And this is something that we want to overcome. So, by the way, we recently this month, published with a colleague, Yunpeng Shang, working in the University College Dublin. We published in this journal, Tedrich for Economics and Social Geography, a very good journal, this special issue on the rent gap. So if you want to find this paper on Australia by Ziegler et al., you can find it here. I also recommend Selim Banabak, working in Vienna, also presenting a model to disaggregate and to differentiate what is the building value, what is the land rent, something that the rent gap studies have not done so far, but I think now we are seeing new experiments and new analysis that can do that. Also, we have 3 papers from China exploring the rent gap as related to gentrification in Chinese cities, and many other countries. Latin America, we have a paper on Cuba. Again, short-term rentals, but we see agents intervening from abroad and also local agents intervening in this market. So I recommend this special issue on the rent gap if you want to see it. Okay, for our analysis, I think I need to rush up a little bit. We see 4 variables. We have a panel of around 200,000 entries of purchases. We know the value, we know the location of the value, we know the characteristics of a property. We know the density of the building where those properties are, those apartments, between 2008 and 2019. So it's a very comprehensive data set. And we see these 4 variables. The first one is the capitalized ground rent, to name it in rent gap jargon, which is the sales prices of the land. Land purchased by firms. We know that they were bought by firms because the ID is different to people, persons buying land. It's a totally different type of number. And they buy land, empty land, and single-family houses. So we know that price. We call it capitalized ground rent. And we also wanted to see how the metro affects apartment prices, because the literature review showed that almost every study on metro effect will find effects on apartment prices. We also wanted to see the land incidence, which is a proxy to sea density. And the land incidence ratio is very interesting because it shows the weight of the land cost to the apartment price. So the more apartments you build in a land site, and the more expensive those apartments are, you will probably find a lower land incidence if the land cost has not increased substantially, which is something that happens a lot. So this third variable was straight to see whether this claim by the developers in Chile was true or not. If we find that land incidence ratio declines near metro station, that means that they are wrong, and it's not the major cause for housing price appreciations. And variable 4 is a rough estimation of the potential ground rent. I say rough because we need to estimate this by using construction costs. It's a residual value. This is total sales of a building minus the land cost minus construction cost. And we use at the end a flat construction cost. And that was highly criticized by the reviewer of this paper. And we have to add this rough estimation because he was right. She was right. It was rough, but still we use in the model different construction cost values, and they all reflected the same results, more or less. So it wasn't that important. We see this in relative terms. So this is a summary of our literature review. For every variable, we found different papers regarding this developer's premium or the potential ground rent. Just works by me and other colleagues. No one has been interested in applying metro effect and rent gap simultaneously. But to see apartment prices here or land prices here, many papers available since the 80s or 70s onwards, started in the United States, Canada, and now in China for the last 15 years, the number of papers doing this has grown substantially. And we see the magnitude of the effect. We see, can you see these numbers? I mean, studies do not agree with this, obviously, different cities, different methodologies, different approaches, but basically, there are substantial effects of metro lines and metro stations on land and apartment prices. We saw design and heterogeneity. Some studies find even negative effects of metro lines. For instance, in places where the metro line creates too much trouble in the surrounding area, a lot of street commerce, a lot of multitudes crowding around the station. So that tends to decrease the price of the land or the price of the apartments. And also we saw the temporality of these metro stations, because it is different when you have an announcement of a new metro station. I'm thinking about Kennedy Town. I mean, 10 years ago, the metro was probably announced, and probably the gentrification process started from the first announcement. I'm just guessing, but maybe it happened, because we saw that in different literature that announcement of metro lines can create effects too, and also the actual construction of the metro line creates effects, and the running of the metro line. So our variable construction was very simple. Land price is an observed variable in the data set. The apartment price is the same. We took it from the Santiago Real Estate Conservatory. Every purchase in Chile must be registered in the Real Estate Conservatory. So it's mandatory, it's very reliable. We didn't have to manage to match this data. There are some errors, digitization errors. So we found a way to filter those errors. So it's very reliable data. And for the land incidence ratio, it's basically it's the land price divided by the apartment price. So the land cost divided by the square meter of the department. That's the land incidence ratio. And then the approximate developer's premium or potential ground rent is a very simple residual equation, which is the total sales minus the land cost minus the construction cost, which in this case was flat number. But this number was validated by developers we interviewed during this research. So it wasn't that far from reality, if you want to say. And all of that divided by the size of the land size, land site size. So that creates a number that is an estimation of potential ground rent per square meter of land. So the statistics of this main variable descriptive is the land price, for instance, was 15.3 in average, the mean, with a standard deviation of 7.4. The apartment price was 49.1. We use UF, which is a measure of real estate prices in Chile. It's at that time was roughly $45 each UF. One UF is equals to $45. 49.1 as apartment price average. Land incidence 0.12, 12% of land incidence in average in Santiago. And we saw that land incidence decrease as one approaches to a metro station. And the developer's premium or the potential ground rent was much higher than the land price or the capitalized ground rent, and was in average 98.5. I think I'm going to skip this one because it's descriptive data per metro line. I will prefer to go directly to these images. Right. Okay, we see these lines. This is the gray lines are the land cost or the capitalized ground rent, and the black lines are the potential ground rent or the developer's premium. And we conducted this very, very rapid descriptive analysis, and we saw that roughly during these years, they tend to diverge. They grow in different intensity. Both curves grow, but the developer's potential ground rent grows more intensively along the years. And if we want to see this in the map, this is land price map. This is an interpolated analysis done in QGIS. It's very, very simple analysis, nothing really complicated. And this is the central eastern affluent area I showed in the beginning, which has the really considerably high land prices for developers. All the rest of the city, land prices are not really relevant. So we are confirming here the typical Latin American pattern of micro-scale segregation, which is also expressed in land prices. That's important to have in mind for the thing I will tell you later. And the second map is the apartment price. Again, a lot of pricey apartments in this area, not really too much pricey areas around the other areas of the city. And this is the land incidence. So this means two things. In this periphery here, except the eastern northeastern periphery, but all the rest of the periphery of the city, it's not that the land price is too high. It's too low. It is that the housing prices are extremely low due to these are social housing estates. So even a low land price is very incident. It's very high for the low prices of the social housing estates being built in this peripheral area. So Latin American cities mean social housing estates, public housing will be built surrounding the outskirts of the city, where the land price is relatively low, but the price of the state, of the houses, is also even lower. So the land incidence is very high here. And also in this area, which is the affluent part of the city, we find here that the land price is very high, and the apartment price is also high, but the land incidence is high because land prices are even higher. And finally, this shows variable number 4, developers premium or potential ground rent in the rent gap jargon. And we see here this typical area where developers are obtaining larger rent gaps or higher revenues as premium, but not substantially due to metro network. In fact, we found here that the metro is decreasing this revenue as they get close to the stations. They want to be farther away from the metro lines because there are more exclusive condos here and neighborhoods. But in the rest of the city, we see these interesting areas here, which present where developers are obtaining very interesting revenues, namely rent gap areas. Now, we ran this simple econometric model specification. R is the observer variable, it could be land price, apartment price, developers revenue or premium. And DM is a dummy variable that takes the value of 1 if the observation is within the 1 kilometer radius from a station, and 0 if observation is outside that radius. And this variable is a combination of the different attributes of a property. For a year I, district C, we call it comunas. Now in Mexico City, they also call it comunas now, the districts of the city, the boroughs of the city. So C is the borough of the city, the comuna, the district, and T is time. And we have controls. We have time control and comuna control or district control. And controlling by the temporality along these years, for instance, microeconomic shocks, variations, or comuna control, for instance, the different socioeconomic prestige of each comuna might affect the price of the observer variable. So we control that too. So these two types of control, time and comuna control, are very effective to make this model fit and robust. And the standard error at the end. And yeah, okay. So this is our variable estimations, the results. We found 5% increase in land prices inside the metro 1 kilometer metro radius Which means that if you own a piece of land within 1 kilometer from a metro station, you will sell it on average 5% higher than that landowner, which is outside that metro radius. So for the same radius, the apartment price grows 9.2%. For the same radius, the land incidence decreases 11.8%, which was surprisingly high, the decrease. So this means a lot of density, relatively high apartment prices, and the land cost is not really relevant. And finally, this gross approximate estimation of the developer's potential ground rent or premium, which is pure revenue, land rent, basically, not due to their efforts, but just because they are close to the metro line, 23.5%. We conducted a very similar analysis using previous data, 5-6 years previous to this data, and we found very similar results. We published this previous paper in Environment and Planning A, year 2019, if you want to compare. This paper has been published recently in Land Use Policy. So if you want to compare these two papers, you will find very similar results, even though we made in purpose different methods in some parts, just to see what happened. And the results are very satisfactory in terms of their coincidence. And we separated the results by every line. And I don't want to bother you with descriptive because you don't know what these lines are, what they mean. But suffice to say that line 5 was created in 1997. It took like 10 years to produce a first building around this area. So it was vacant, absolutely no developer interested in the area surrounding this line. This line goes from the center of the city to the south. It's a working class area. It used to be an industrial area. And now it presents developers' premium or potential ground rent is 33.8% on average higher, being inside the metro radius than outside. So this is the largest rent gap. And if we go to see the effect in apartment prices, is 14.2% higher. And if we go to see the land incidence around this line 5 is minus 22.4% decrease in the land incidence. So this means higher stories, more density, more pricey apartments, more revenues. This is the perfect case of rent gap gentrification, density gentrification. I mean, this is Mishi, Chen, Neil Smith, Martin Smolka, Brett Christophers, all together working here, predicting what is going on in line 5. And line 5 is the image that I use in the cover of this presentation. This is the most impressive change in Santiago being built. So if you go to Santiago, please take the metro and go directly to line 5 to see what I'm saying, because lots of new buildings are being built around, and very high new buildings in an area which was characterized by being working class. 50 years ago, we had a military coup d'etat. There was guerrilla fighting the army in those areas precisely because they were workers defending the socialist government in that area. And now we see this area as an example of gentrification and super rent gap capture. So to discuss results, the average ratio between the potential ground rent and capitalized ground rent is 4.4 to 1. Same ratio we found 5 years ago in the other study. So something is happening in Santiago. I mean, this is like a trademark of Santiago, to my views, according to my analysis, of course. There's a huge difference between the capture of rent that the developer can achieve compared to what the landowner can achieve. So when everybody says, or somebody says, oh, it is a land price, land is too costly for developers, we present this study and say, lookout. In some areas, it could be, of course. But in general, or especially line 5, around line 5, that's not the case. So this is not taxed at all, this revenue. And this is revenue created by state funding, state investment in transport infrastructure. So it opens a lot of debates on land value capture, of course, like a Lincoln Institute does, or people in Rutgers University, in a project that Ben Gerloff's works to about land value capture. There are experiences of land value capture here, of course. This is emblematic, also in Taiwan. But in Chile, it's not a good case of land value capture, and these developers go untaxed. We can confidently claim that, land prices do not seem to be the primary cause for housing price appreciations. But on the other hand, the impact of the proximity to metro is very consistent with the literature, the effects of apartment prices. There is a high level of heterogeneity, but line 5 seems to be like the jewel of the crown in terms of gentrification and rent gap. I will analyze that in my next presentation on the 1st of March. So conclusions in terms of methods and concepts. This type of regressions controlling by time and comuna or district seems very efficient to make these estimations. Otherwise, results can be very divergent. It is really important to see this. I think we believe this is a very good method to analyze rent gap at the metropolitan scale. One limitation is that we don't know exactly how much developers capture. We know in percentage values in relation to those outside the metro radius, 1 kilometer metro radius, but we don't know exactly, we cannot confidently say how much they capture. So this is like a limitation of this study. I say 23.5% higher because you are close to the metro station, but not how much. So that's something that still we need to work a little bit more on that. And if we want to see increases in housing prices or short-term rental prices like Bashmus and Weisler or Ziegler et al., we need to conduct a totally different type of analysis. We need to disaggregate property value, land values, and they go in separate channels. And this type of analysis does not do that. But my point is, I don't want to speak to be too critic. I don't want to criticize Bashmus and Weisler and Ziegler et al., but they don't do that either. I mean, they confuse land rent and housing rent. If you want to see how this rent gap correlates with housing prices, please come to my next presentation, one of my next presentations on the 1st of March. Thank you very much. And open to your questions if there are.
So the floor is open. Ooh, this light is bright right here. Ronnie or George?
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that, and I learned a bit because I know nothing about this literature. So I have a number of questions, mainly because of my ignorance. But so I guess one question would be, what's happening at line 4A, where it's the coefficients seem to be going in the different direction for line 4A? What's the story there? But I guess a more general question is this idea of potential ground rents and the methodology that you've developed. So I come from the UK, so ground rents in the UK system are usually, in sort of for ordinary people, ground rents refer to the value that long leaseholders have to pay to landowners for buying their apartments. And those typically come with contracts, like either, the worst of these contracts are like a doubling of ground rents every 10 years, which make it, which are very, very unfair terms. But other ways of increasing ground rents are known, increasing with inflation rates and so on. So I guess I'm trying to understand, if we applied your method of estimating potential ground rents, but say in the UK context, but here we've got almost like a very robust measure of ground rents in the future, estimated from leasehold contracts. Would that be useful?
You want to collect a couple and then respond, or respond to each one?
I don't know if there are more questions.
Sure.
We'll collect several.
Okay, we'll take a couple.
Thank you. I very much enjoy your presentation, and certainly there is a strong interest, not just in Asian cities or Southeast Asian cities. I think here many of my colleagues and students are also very interested in Latin American cities. So your presentation fits very well into our research agenda. I got perhaps just a couple kind of specific questions out of my curiosity. First of all, you have clarified what you call the rent gap. I mean, you clarify that, well, it is the existing value and the potential value. And I think that is a very interesting perspective to understand gentrification. My question then is, in your research, did you ever observe any correlation between rent gap on the one hand and density on the other? Density on the other. Theoretically, we can assume that the greater the rent gap, the greater the density. So that is question one. The second question is, in your presentation, you presented not only density, but also the metro system. Obviously, is a very important factor shaping mobility. My question is employment. What is the relationship between this variation in density, rent gap on the one hand, and proximity to employment? I mean, and then finally, coming to perhaps a more conceptual theoretical issue. I mean, we talk about gentrification. And mind you, not long ago in IJR, International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, I'm sure you probably noticed that there is actually debate in a forum there between David Lay and his colleagues who came to Hong Kong and subsequently wrote a piece of work on gentrification in Hong Kong. But then it triggered a tremendous critique from a bunch of local Hong Kong geographers, arguing that this is an overstretch of an American concept into Asia. So now here you are working on Latin America. So I wonder whether you have any remark, you have any comment that this concept of gentrification from Europe and North America, to what extent your research in Latin America could actually say that, well, the concept of gentrification is applicable, or to what extent it is applicable. Anyway, I hope that will be helpful to discussion. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Is there a last question we can collect in this round of three, maybe? Ben, yeah.
Much more simple question. I was interested to know how distinctive this case is to Chile, and whether other cities in Chile are much different or similar.
Compared to other Chilean cities.
Maybe we'll take those three first when you're ready.
Okay, very good question. Thank you very much. I will try to answer them properly. When you say coefficients, you mean the results or in the literature review? Okay, basically all were positive, but land incidence was negative. That is because there was higher density in the results of that. More density, higher apartment prices, land costs did not grow that much, so it was a negative coefficient. That's what. Am I responding to your question?
I thought I might, a negative coefficient for the apartment price.
In some lines.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Can I show? I mean, that's very interesting because, yeah, if you let me. So for instance, where?
Line 4A, so the apartment price.
Yes, you are right. Very good, very good. It took us weeks to analyze this. Basically, social housing across this line. One of the poorest areas in the city, and the metro created an effect, but was contrary-wise to what everyone was expecting there. It's a very segregated area, and the National Agency for Social Housing had built land sites previously, so it acted. The state behaved like a speculator here across this line and built a lot of social housing there. So that's decreased the observed apartment prices for that area. But was for us was a surprise. Yeah. So the state intervenes here, and another research that a thesis researcher has just finished and analyzing announcements of new metro lines also found negative coefficients in apartment prices and land prices in the peripheral area of Santiago. Same reason. It's the state intervening the housing market by buying very well in advance and buying subsidized housing at very low prices. So we still find some sort of robust state action in social housing production in Chile, even though it's like an example of neoliberalism and super free market economy.
Even the announcement, state intervention.
Yeah.
Generates this.
Yeah, the announcement generated the effect. So the state is not that slow as many people try to say. I mean, they can be very fast too. The state agency for social housing construction. Yeah. But that's the only one. All the rest are positive coefficients. And also you see that land incidence increases. So for the same reason. Yeah. This is not my favorite part of the city at all. Yeah. It's in the south. In the south, it's here. It's here. So if you say La Cisterna, San Ramon, La Granja, those comunas, those districts, boroughs, are facing a lot of crime problems, a lot of social problems, people living in relatives' houses, a lot of housing deficit there. Many indices showing that deprivation and poverty there. But anyway, the metro network is transforming this geography, the socioeconomic geography in the city. So 10 years later, maybe in the future, we will see these areas turn into something very different. Who knows? Regarding your other question about the potential ground rent in the lease contracts in England, I don't know. I mean, that's a system that we don't have in Latin America. This very powerful landlords leasing land to developers and to build buildings, something that exists in Singapore, for instance, or even Hong Kong, where the state is the landlord and operates by leasing land. Yeah, but I think this method can help predict land prices or land lease prices increases. Yeah. So especially given these new infrastructures being added. So I don't know if somebody has analyzed here what happened with the extension of the island line towards Kennedy Town, how it affected apartment prices, or maybe could affect land leases here. But in the British case, I don't know. I mean, it's too complicated. I wouldn't feel responsible to respond, but it's a very interesting question. Thank you for your provocation. So if there is correlation between density and rent gap, we believe there is. And these results show that. Yeah, because in average, I mean, a higher land incidence is a good proxy to see higher density, basically. So the more developers premium, these results by line, we disaggregated the data in different ways, but I didn't want to bother you with too many results. So I brought this separation by lines. But we see where we have high land incidence decreases. We have high developers premiums increases. So yeah, density is basically what is creating the largest rent gaps. This is something that people in Taiwan is seeing, Mishi is seeing a lot. Yeah, so the concept of density rent gap, I think something we need to pay more attention on it. It's very interesting to see. Neil Smith did not see this because New York at the time was not being redeveloped so substantially in high rise, but now it is. So probably we need to adapt a little bit the concept. Yeah, the issue with mobility and employment. Yeah, well, of course, the metro is creating, it's not just opening areas for developers to build, but also it's bringing mobility closer to people who really need it. So I'm very fond of a metro state-owned enterprise in Santiago. It does a very good job at bringing mobility to people, even though it's not cheap at all. And there have been a lot of protests and social unrest due to increases in the price of the metro. The last very heavy one was in 2019. We called it the estallido social, the social outburst. It started by an increase of 30 Chilean pesos, which corresponds to 0.2 Hong Kong dollars. But the people were really fed up with increases and the increase of the cost of life. And it started to unfold as a massive protest in the country. And it started because of the price of the metro line. So yeah, it's core. The metro network is core for people in Santiago. And it's the basis of the transport system in the city. I wish policymakers and transport policymakers were more aware of the effects that the metro creates in the real estate market and the land market, but they don't. They say, no, we don't see that. We don't take decisions based on that. Of course, we know these effects on the land prices and land market, but there is nothing we can do because we are experts on transport and our decisions are purely based on the benefit of the people in terms of mobility. So yeah, this is an example of states where everything is seen separate. We don't have master governing of the city, integrated governing of the city. Like, for instance, Mexico City. I say Mexico City because this is an expert. Professor Gael Roth is an expert in Mexico City. He wrote a book on it. They are attempting to achieve like metropolitan governance. Also, Buenos Aires has one. Santiago has not. So you see the transport things and the real estate things separate. That's a big mistake. And your third question is about, this is a different story about if the term gentrification is overstretched. I think it is not. We are going to have a conversation with Bern in a couple of days to talk precisely about this. And well, it might be, I prefer to have a concept overstretched if this concept will motivate conversations like this. Because if every one of us use a different concept of gentrification, we would never gather to speak about displacement and rent gaps on development. So I prefer overstretching the concept. Of course, people in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, they say, we don't care about that. We have gentrification as usual. Gentrification has been mutating in our countries in some ways. We want to see that. This is what gentrification means. All the rest of the world It's not gentrification. I very much respect that perspective. I've seen many papers recently being published from the United States or England. They don't cite anything outside their boundaries, anything, just Anglo-Saxon authors being cited. I don't get bothered about that. So basically, I see two ways of seeing gentrification. Traditional way of seeing gentrification, the Anglo-American, Northern European one. All the rest, in the other side. And we try to get a conversation because we see something which is really important. We see the city being transformed by the power, by the political connections, by the technical capacities that certain type of agents have and others don't. In my views, that's gentrification, generically, like Eric Clark said 20 years ago. And David Lee, I think, is trying to exemplify here. So I think gentrification is a very good field of debate. So if we're going to close the debate by saying, no, it's too overstretched, let's get rid of the concept outside the boundaries of the Anglo-European areas. Okay, I'm not much into that. But I very much respect those who say that gentrification is overstretched. I mean, this is matter to debate, of course.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Just to say, I think these conversations, exactly as you say, like having a platform to have these kinds of debates, I think is extremely important from an academic intellectual perspective. I also think it's worth pointing out that these moves to police the boundaries around a concept like gentrification or any other concept that works kind of in this way, especially regional policing of the boundaries, is itself a kind of political move, right? And there are reasons why people do this, some of which are about like methodological issues. Like, does this thing methodologically measure up the same in different places? Sometimes they're academic political maneuvers, like we want to sort of develop a new concept that's ours, that works in this place. There are different reasons why people make these arguments, and they're often conflated in the literature as if like gentrification does or does not work in this place in one way or another. There are many things going on in that question, which are not all related strictly to whether this concept does or does not function. So just a little addition there.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, the last question is, what are the differences between Santiago and the rest of the cities in the country? All of them except one, Valparaiso, have metro lines. So we need to search for amenities in different ways. This is something I would like to do. The problem is the data. I mean, other difference is that almost all the data is in Santiago. Latin American countries are the primacy index, you know that? We use a lot that concept in Latin America. The primacy index is how big is the main city of the country compared to the rest. So primacy index in Latin America is very high. Peru, not that much. Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, Buenos Aires is 20 million metropolis. And the city that follows is like 1.5 or 2 million people. So it's huge, the difference. In Santiago is 7 million versus 1 million, the next that follows. So you don't have the data. You don't have the quality of the data. You don't have the same amenities. You don't have the size. So it's very difficult to analyze in the rest of the city. So phenomena in those cities tend to be seen differently. More qualitative analysis in those areas, more environmentally concerned. But yeah, of course, basically structurally, if we saw all the cities 100 years ago were all the same, Spanish, quadrangular, foundational structure, the same in Mexico, Buenos Aires, and Peru. Now they have changed and Santiago has grown rapidly. But the other one that has a metro line, Valparaiso Viña, that's similar path. That metro line is one single metro line. Chile is a very poor country compared to Hong Kong or China, of course. So that other city has one metro line, which is a very long one, by the way. But it attracts a lot of real estate interest, a lot in certain areas. So yeah, definitely. We see, at least in this sense of this type of analysis, we see similarities between those two.
Any additional questions? I have one, but I want to hold on. Maybe I'll ask mine. Mine's kind of a dummy question, if you don't mind.
Okay,
I want to take advantage of the expertise I have. In front of me. The rent gap, I love how you've taken apart these different sort of pieces of rent gap theory. This is work I feel like it's so rarely done. We all assume that we understand what Neil Smith meant by the rent gap. And I teach this concept and I use that piece from 79 in my like intro survey of urban geography course, and also in my social justice in the city. And I find this explanation somewhat tricky, even at a very simple level, like what his graphs meant, as opposed to say Walksmith and Weisler, was it?
Yeah.
Their graphs. The question I want to ask you is, if we take like building value, the stuff on the land, if we separate this off analytically from, strictly speaking, ground rent, why is time a factor at all? So if we have off like the depreciation piece, the amortization piece, if we take all that stuff out, why is it not just space instead of time on like Walksmith and Weisler's graphs? Like how is ground rent an issue of time? That's what I'm asking. Can you explain the curve over time? Why is the X variable time?
because I mean, Neil Smith said this, it's the building value, it's the depreciation of the built structure
Yes.
that brings the ground rent down.
This isn't still involved. This analytic.
It is still involved,
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. It
That
is
was the piece
still
I was
involved.
missing.
Yeah, because it's too ruined, so it's the ground rent that which declines at the
I
end.
see.
Yeah.
Okay.
this
That was
is-
the piece I was missing. I was thinking you were taking out like depreciation, building values, all these things, separating this out.
Yes,
But they're-
yes,
They're staying.
yes.
together. Okay.
Yeah, but your question is good because theoretically, many economists say land never depreciates.
Mhm.
So it might seem contradictory
Yes.
to what Neil Smith said. I think he was seeing two extreme cases of depreciation. Round down areas in Baltimore, which is a very deprived city in the United States at that time, or still is maybe.
And Chicago, I think he was
Oh,
working with
Chicago,
that whole
yeah,
data
yeah.
early on.
Yeah, so he was seeing the rent gap by this decline, this ground rent declining, pushed down by the bad quality of the property and the derelict condition of the property built within it. That's a way to see it, but I would say the most contemporary analysis of rent gap are seeing the other way around. I mean, it's the potential ground rent that grows.
Mhm.
And this Bashmos and Weisler see that. In fact, he doesn't see renovation in the premises in New York. He doesn't see any effort
Yeah.
by the property owner to renovate the properties. This is something that the Hungarian case we have in the special issue I showed you in the beginning. In Hungary, they apply the same analysis of short-term rentals. Again, people don't renovate, just send it to Airbnb because Airbnb clients, they just want to stay 2-3 nights. They don't care too much about the quality of the premise. So that creates a lot of potential ground rent by even not increasing the quality of the building value. Yeah, I mean, there are different ways to see this. Yeah, the question is good. It's good.
Any last questions? If not, let's thank Ernesto again for sharing with us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention.
And do look out for Ernesto's other events, talks, and also other events through the Methods Hub. There's another one in a week's time, I think, right? Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks, everybody.